Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Friday, the 25th of July, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby, flying right through July. And with that, let's bring Robert on and going to jump inside the Beltway. Let's start with this USDA thing. So it looks like the Trump administration is moving a large bulk of USDA workers out of D.C. to across the country. What's going on there, Robert?
Good morning, Mike. Yeah, the Trump administration is moving at least 50% of USDA jobs out of DC, and they're going to set up effectively a hub system, and these are going to be in North Carolina, Utah, Colorado, Missouri, and Indiana. And they said they're going to consolidate the USDA regional offices into these new hubs, which I think this is maybe good news for a lot of the food security issues we've talked about over the last few years, like that Chronobacter bacteria issue with baby formula a couple of years ago, that showed up in children's applesauce, because a lot of these USDA inspectors, just like the FDA, have had issues with completing required food safety inspections. Mm-hmm. And then Representative Sam Graves, a Missouri Republican, and Rick Larson, a Democrat from Washington, they introduced what they're calling the Fix Emergency Management for Americans Act of 2025. And this would return FEMA to an independent cabinet-level agency that reports directly to the president. And I looked through an explainer for this bill that was put out before the full text, and it's going to do a few key things that I think will help get this bill passed, because it will have a lot of bipartisan support. It's going to streamline a lot of the disaster assistance funding process, and also bar any kind of political discrimination for any disaster funding.
Like red state, blue states. Well, I guess, I don't know, one question is, how can you determine what's political discrimination and what's not? Because any administration can just come up with a reason to say, basically cap federal funds for these disasters.
Yeah, I think this is probably going to have to be a case by case basis, like the accusations against FEMA employees that last year here in Florida, that they had openly said they were avoiding homes with Trump flags outside or Trump political signs. And I think also Democrats will see this as blocking the Trump administration from using disaster assistance funding for political purposes with blue states like California, including things for things like wildfires. Mm-hmm. Right. And then the Department of Homeland Security announced that they're setting up a joint Homeland Task Force in Houston, Texas. And this is going to include not just ICE's Homeland Security investigations and the FBI, but also the DEA, ATF, IRS, U.S. Marshals. And I saw that the U.S. Postal Inspectors are also going to be involved with this, as well as local law enforcement in Southeast Texas. And they said the goal of this is to eliminate transnational criminal organizations throughout Southeast Texas. And then staying in Texas, there's what looks to be a test case for that new implementation of denaturalization in the DOJ that we talked about, I think, a month ago. There is a Houston-based naturalized citizen who is basically being sued by the Department of Justice to denaturalize her over a tax fraud conviction that was where she was convicted in 2019 of committing tax fraud prior to receiving citizenship. And I did see where there were some former federal officials and legal experts who worked for the federal government saying that this type of case is actually very rare, where the U.S. pursues denaturalization for things like minor tax fraud and other nonviolent criminal charges. So I think this is a test case for that expanded focus on denaturalization from the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you, do you know, does this have to go through an immigration court, this denaturalization process?
Not that I could find, because there's basically, under U.S. law, two different types. There's a civil case, which I think this is what this case is, which is actually much easier for the government to win. Not as easy as administrative denaturalization, which was ended by the Supreme Court, I think, in 2013. But it also, the person being accused, the naturalized citizen being accused of lying to get citizenship, doesn't have as many rights under a civil case from the DOJ than if they had been accused of some kind of crime. In some of the other cases that are publicly available that are announced are criminal charges, and they are much more common than this type of case.
Mm-hmm. I would not be surprised to see something like a No Kings or a hands-off style National Day of Resistance or protest around denaturalization, because hasn't the Trump administration previously signaled they're going to ramp up denaturalization and start stripping some of these people and deporting them back to their countries?
Yes, and that was that memo that I think we talked about a month or so ago, where they're not just renewed focus on it, but I think they're also expanding basically the categories they're going to go after for denaturalization. And in this case, the tax fraud or minor, basically what I think the Supreme Court called like minor lies on citizenship applications.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then yesterday, the anti-ICE protester that was famously on video for throwing those pavers at ICE vehicles in LA in June was arrested, and he's a 39-year-old from Compton, California, named Elpidio Reyna. And he was actually detained at the border. Apparently, he fled after the FBI put out a $50,000 bounty on information leading to his arrest, and he was arrested by Mexican authorities in the state of Sinaloa, and then agreed to surrender to the FBI.
Wow. You love to see it. You love to see security cooperation between the United States and Mexico, because that is probably the number one spot if you're trying to evade U.S. law enforcement. Dip down to Mexico. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Good news all around. And let's go ahead and move on here. Jared, good morning. Let's start off with South Korea.
Good morning. So, coming from anonymous South Korean industry officials across numerous industries, South Korea is reportedly going to offer $100 million investment into the United States during their next trade meeting. They were supposed to have one today, but it's getting bumped back to the 31st. Just Besson had stuff pop up. Now, the industry sources claim that this will involve investment commitments, not from the South Korean government itself necessarily, but from major South Korean conglomerates like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG, along with SK Group. So should actually probably bring back a fair bit of manufacturing here. Staying in South Korea is charging 2 Chinese men with, quoting here, benefiting an enemy and undermining national military interests after they were found to be responsible for 9 illegal drone flights over Korean Fleet Command. That's, where the Korean Navy primarily headquarters are. So this actually included one incident in June of 2024 where they took pictures and video of the USS Theodore Roosevelt during a South Korean presidential visit.
Well, Jared, it's safe to assume if it's happening in South Korea, it's obviously happening here as well. Have you seen any, we've seen a couple of hearings in the Senate and the House over the past couple of weeks on drone threats. And one of those was, in one of those hearings, they talked about, they basically said there's no way, forget about stopping drones. There's not even really any way that you can track all these drones and track who's flying them and really determine authoritatively whether a drone poses a threat or not. So right now, this is just surveillance or maybe reconnaissance of this. But have you seen anything here in the United States beyond what we've already talked about?
No.
Okay. All right. Just curious. Thanks for that. Let's go ahead and move on to Iran.
Okay. So Iranian officials are meeting with, basically, in a nutshell, Iran is re-entering nuclear diplomacy. So to that end, Iranian officials are meeting with officials from France, Germany, and the United Kingdom to avoid a reapplication of European sanctions. That's all happening today. Now, those sanctions are for non-compliance with the International Atomic Energy Agency. But coming almost immediately out of that meeting, the IAEA chief said that Iran had agreed to allow another visit just to reestablish relations between IAEA and Iran. So it's not going to inspect nuclear sites, but at least get them talking again. Mm-hmm. Now, Iran's deputy foreign minister also announced that Iran would be willing to re-enter negotiations with the United States as well. Now, my main concern here is that there's an impasse on will Iran be allowed to have uranium enrichment, because they went up to like 60% enriched. prior to it, and that's what led to Operation Midnight Hammer, the strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, and also the Israeli actions over Iran as well. So I'm concerned that we could end up right back down that road at a much quicker pace than the roughly 18 months that Iran was initially assessing to get back on its feet. Okay. Moving over to Germany, the German government is introducing legislation to assess all 18-year-old German men's willingness to serve in the military. And at the same time, this legislation will implement a mandatory fitness screening beginning in 2028. Now, in the event, all this is to figure out, okay, well, what kind of reserves we even have for the German military in the event that we need them. And in the event that Germany cannot hit its recruitment quotas on a voluntary basis, it does allow for the German parliament to re-implement compulsory service, which has been basically nullified since 2011.
Mm-hmm. You know, this is amazing to me because you look at the demographics in big cities like Frankfurt and other places, and how much of young people there are not native Germans, not ethnic Germans. They're ethnic, or they're Arabs, or they're some flavor of Middle Eastern or whatever, North African. I do wonder about the show up rate between Hans and Mohammed. I mean, Mohammed's not going to go enlist in the German military to go fight Russia. Doesn't seem to me. It's going to be incredibly messy for these countries that are actively talking about building up to go fight Russia. The Germans are, I think, some Germans are serious about it. Serious in their expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have to be. Russia's their primary security threat. You have to take it seriously, just plain and simple.
Oh, yeah, of course. But no, these people are like, I think they're convinced. We saw that document that was published by German intelligence. And one of the things they're saying is that Russia's going to try a limited incursion into the Suwalki Gap between Lithuania and Poland. And, they didn't provide any operational recommendations, obviously, but that would come under Article 5 of NATO. And so Germany is basically right there, in terms of being able to respond to that. So, again, this is something that's obviously not going to happen overnight. If this does happen, I would expect it to go a lot like this Ukraine invasion back in 2022, where we saw this large Russian military buildup. It's not like you can, just sneak a bunch of assets to the border. But I'd say we start seeing we'll leave it there for now. But I really grapple with this thought about what is the future of Germany if they do get into if there is a NATO-Russia conflict, and you have all these European countries draft their natives to go fight a war in Russia and no one else. I mean, we're talking about like actual civilizational suicide here. At any rate, not news. But go ahead, Jared.
So we've touched on it here and there, haven't covered it extensively, but there does seem to be an anti-migratory push in Europe, including, if I remember right, it was Germany that was starting to do actual deportations. So,
well, it's kind of like the United States. You bring millions in and you deport 10,000. It's a drop in the bucket, and you pat yourself on the back and you say, "Good job, we did it." And you don't make a hill of beans worth of a difference. And also, this is not Europe. And Jared, I'm not lecturing you, obviously, but Europe's migration problems are extremely unlike the United States problems, because here, we obviously do have some problems, but it's not. Guatemalans are not talking about implementing Sharia law in the United States, but that's absolutely what they're talking about in Germany and some of these other countries. Where, all right, I don't want to get off on a tangent here. I think we all see what's happening, but at any rate, let's go ahead and move on. Talk about Panama.
Yep, Panama. So people in Panama, didn't see which people it was, but take a guess based off of on what's causing their ire. They're accusing the Panamanian president of pandering to the United States after a Chinese community monument. Now, this is a monument to the Chinese community in Panama, was removed near the Las Americas Bridge. Now, President Molino, the Panamanian president, says that the issue is unrelated to the U.S.-China diplomatic issue. Sorry, but the United States is and will be Panama's partner regarding security, tourism, migration, and logistics. So he's nominally going, yeah, we're going to remain neutral. We're not going to be pulled. But when it comes to basically committing any kind of major move inside of Panama, the U.S. is going to back us, not China. He's picking which side of the fence he's going to be on here.
Mm-hmm. Hey, just one thing too. I noticed just a couple of days ago, reading through Mexican news, the Mexican government actually ordered the statues of Che Guevara and Fidel Castro removed from some monument that was in Mexico City. So, we've talked a lot about some of these Latin countries, and I'm not saying that Mexico's obviously moving to the right. They're not. Moreno is a leftist party. They've got one party rule. They absolutely will not. But pretty shocking that the Mexican government is ordering the removal of these statues, and I think we've maybe talk a little bit more about that. Let's do that later. All right, thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on here. We've got 519 protests coming up this weekend. It's a bit above average, and I think I have not seen the next date for like the big national day of action. There was one on, I think, July 17th that was nowhere near the size of previous ones, but the next one I think they're planning is Labor Day in, I don't know, September, whenever that is. All right. And with that, we'll go ahead and move on. All right, Robert, let's talk about this because there's a lot of gloves coming off kind of speak here for Democrats. And you have these former Biden officials now coming out basically saying the Trump administration, they say, is violating so many norms, those guardrails that we heard so much about, bending the guardrails or stepping over the guardrails, that Democrats just need to do the same and essentially go somewhat full bore when they're back in power.
Yeah, that's correct. So these are two former Biden officials who worked for the Federal Trade Commission, and they released an op-ed yesterday, and they're calling on Democrats to, quote, break free from the norms. And they also are calling on Democrats to abolish some regulatory agencies under the Office of Management and Budget that provide oversight on other federal agencies, and also limit what they call judicial meddling in economic policy choices. And this is specifically for when Democrats take power back from Republicans. Their argument is that the Trump administration has demonstrated that you can effectively ignore rules and norms that constrain government action, that they're not what they call fixed laws of nature, and that Democrats shouldn't fear any kind of political cost for ignoring them. And I think what's important about this is that, like a lot of op-eds and think tanks that release information for lawmaker consumption, they're creating effectively a permission structure for Democrats to ignore a lot of bureaucratic hurdles or any kind of oversight that they say is gatekeeping Democrats from taking bold actions. And they are also, in this article, calling on Democrats to openly implement what is effectively a shadow cabinet model that's similar to what a lot of European political parties use, where when they're the opposition party, they're not in control of government. They effectively appoint party members to maintain what they call shadow portfolios for key government positions, so that when they do take back power, they're able to get started on day one, actually implementing policy.
Mm-hmm. Just one tangential point here. There was a really great interview I watched yesterday with Michael Every and Britt Johnson on some YouTube channel. And one of the things that Michael Every was talking about, again, he's a global strategist at Rabobank, which is a Dutch multinational bank. He's been way out ahead on a bunch of these Trump policy pivots, economic statecraft, other things. And what he said, he said, look, they're talking about the future of the Trump administration, the future of who controls the country. And Every's point, I'll just boil it down for you briefly. He said, maybe not everyone likes Trump, but he said, but look at the alternative. Like, look at Mamdani in New York City. He said the mainstream does not want Mamdani. And he said there's basically going to be no going back to the center. Like our choice is either going to be Mamdani and maybe I'm overstating his point, but the thing that I got was basically he's saying, look, the future is either Mamdani style leftism or Trump style, whatever small c conservative, whatever ism. And, that sure seems to be the case. We've heard from the James Carvilles and some of these other Democrats who call themselves moderates, and they say, oh, the Democrat Party needs to come back to the center and try to govern from the center. And if we get back, when we get back in power, we've got to reinstall the guardrails, and we have to be, right down the center. And I just see a lot of rank and file Democrats saying, no, actually, let's not do that. Let's push with everything we've got the other way. And I'll tell you, Robert, at the point that you have rank and file on both sides pushing in opposite directions, which is what we've had for, I don't know, probably since, I honestly, you look at the big leftward swing under Obama, and it's clear this has been happening for a while, but a little concerning to me. Is that what you see happening?
Yeah, at the beginning of the year, I thought that there would be more of a struggle between the moderate Democrats and the more progressive Democrats and more left-leaning parts of the Democratic coalition. But I think that the more moderate Democrats just haven't been able to really get their feet under them, and the more progressive and left parts of the Democratic coalition are basically eating their lunch. And Mamdani's a great example of that. Andrew Cuomo, who I think looking at the polling, won some of the more traditional Democratic demographics, Democratic-based demographics like college educated. I think he took a slight majority in like college educated white progressives. It just was completely blown out effectively. And then same thing happened in Minneapolis and Minnesota, where someone who is much more openly progressive and left-leaning than the alternative candidate and for the mayor of Minneapolis was also basically completely shut out of what is their version. In Minnesota, the Democratic Party is called the DFL, shut out of their primary.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I think right now the left-leaning and progressive parts of the coalition are basically running away with the whole thing.
Mm. Yeah, I see that as well. And there is a question. We'll cover the question here, but it's about the 2028 elections. And I don't know, Robert, it's very difficult for me, and it's not impossible. And maybe I don't want to say a best case scenario, but it's maybe a better case scenario than the other way. But maybe there's a scenario where Democrats do run a centrist, but centrists really don't excite the base. That's the big problem, is centrists don't get people angry enough to go out and vote. Only the more extremes do. So, all right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to this lawsuit. So one of the things we've talked about previously is we're looking at the Los Angeles operation, the big surge there with ICE and other federal law enforcement agencies, National Guard, Marine Corps. And that was going to last somewhere between 30 to 60 days, that big surge style operation. I'm not sure if we're going to see another surge kind of like we saw in LA, but I know ICE has previously talked about it. Previously, Tom Homan, the border security czar, or whatever he is now, said, we're going to flood the zone in New York City. And frankly, I think that's where everyone should be looking next. And so it looks like this lawsuit maybe, I don't want to say shaping operations, but it sure seems like their Trump administration is trying to get New York City, get the courts to force city officials to go along with an ICE surge. Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, and this lawsuit is specifically targeting a recent decision from the New York City City Council. They passed a new sanctuary city regulation, which effectively made ICE arrests illegal unless they had a judicial warrant. Normally, ICE operations are done through administrative or what are called detainers, where they are warrants that ICE uses to effect these immigration arrests, but they're not necessarily issued by like a New York State judge or a federal Article III court judge. And New York City is saying that this is illegal. Now, this lawsuit is saying that New York City is trying to regulate the federal government, and I think they have a pretty strong case for that. But I think there's also a second angle here that The Trump administration, as reported at the beginning of the year, stood up this thing called the Sanctuary Cities Working Group. And the idea was that if a local or state level official or government tried to obstruct ICE immigration enforcement, they would be specifically individually targeted with either civil or criminal charges. And I think this is also part of setting up potentially to do that, because we've already seen a couple of officials either threatened with criminal charges or actually hit with a civil lawsuit by the DOJ over obstructing immigration enforcement. The Trump administration did take similar actions against Los Angeles, their city council, prior to that immigration surge. So I think this is kind of a preamble to a potential surge, because it seems like the Trump administration is doing a two-pronged strategy where they are in the courts trying to lock up these local governments and get them to cooperate, while at the same time they put ICE agents and military personnel, National Guard especially, on the ground to actually conduct arrests and provide security for ICE facilities. And I have seen that New York City Mayor Eric Adams has not publicly fully opposed the Trump administration. He has said that he would cooperate, specifically if they go after illegal alien violent criminals. But I think it's also possible we could still see a similar level of resistance in New York City as the Trump administration faced in Los Angeles. And then one more point. DHS said yesterday that they have actually issued 6,025 of these arrest detainers in New York City so far this year, which they say is a 400% increase over the Biden administration in the same time period. I think they also said the Biden administration only issued about 9,000 over in the entire 4-year administration. Oh, you're muted, Mike.
Yeah, one of the things that we saw, in Los Angeles, actually going back to April, is the LA City Council went to the state of California and requested state taxpayer funds to build what they called a community defense program for illegals in LA. This is something that they saw coming. They're prepared for. To my knowledge, they got money directly from the state to do this. Would you please pay attention, take a look at what the New York City Council is doing? I know New York's a little bit different from California, in New York City, especially because Eric Adams appears a lot more agreeable to some immigration enforcement operations there. However, I just bring this up just looking at early warning indicators. If there's a lot of fundraising, whether it's public or private, doesn't matter, then that would lead me to believe that they are organizing for LA-style confrontation in New York City if we do see this big ICE surge in New York City, which apparently that may be the next target. Also, Portland, Seattle, Chicago are also on there. So I guess it's just going to be like a couple of years of these surge operations. We'll see. So thanks for that, Robert. Anything to add before we move on?
No.
Okay. All right. Thanks. And Jared, let's get back on the topic of Latin America. So we previously talked about this potential blue wave. Let's set this up here. So there's been some kind of diplomatic rift here between the United States and Colombia. Colombia's obviously pivoting towards China. We've been covering that here for, basically Petro's since he was elected president in, was that 2022 or sometime?
Yep.
So this has been a long time coming. We're probably not at a culminating phase here, but why don't we just have you start off with what's happening internally in Colombia?
Will do. So he's got two big issues that he's facing pushback on. First, stopping coal exports to Israel. Back in, I think it was 2023, he cut ties with Israel diplomatically and shut off coal exports. And the new binational economic zone with Venezuela, which we covered, I think it was 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. Now, starting on the coal issue to Israel, President Petro accused his own government officials of disobeying the order to cease all coal shipments to it. Now, to enforce this order, last night he told the Colombian Navy that they're going to receive orders to stop ships bound for Israel, effectively a very niche blockade of his own ships. Now, he also called for the Minister of Labor to immediately meet with the coal unions to figure out, hey, why are you still selling this stuff? And then over on the border with Venezuela, one of the presidential candidates that's running to replace Petro, which Petro is not currently running to go again, but his successor would presumably carry on. Anyway, one of the opposition candidates filed a lawsuit claiming that the binational treaty with Venezuela was not signed by high enough authority. Basically, it would have to be cabinet level, and it was not. So he's asking the Supreme Court to just nullify it entirely. And at the same time, one of the sitting senators, who's part of an opposition party, is accusing Petro of handing Colombia's sovereignty over to what she called a narco dictator, Nicolas Maduro, and promised that if her party were to win, or if the right-wing coalition were to win, they would revert the decision entirely.
Mm-hmm. All right, so Colombia does have elections coming up in May 2026, less than a year from now. Is there, I guess let's just cover this now, Jared. So there's a question: what level of influence does China have over Colombia? So we know a lot about Chinese elite capture, how they ensnare and embroil these senior leaders in foreign countries. Is that what's happening here in Colombia?
I don't know if it's necessarily that so much as it is a kind of a remnant of the Cold War, because you had, basically pro-U.S., pro-Israel forces that were down in Latin America all throughout it, and then everybody else was pro-USSR, anti-Israel, and it seems like Petro is just kind of a product of that time, being that he was basically born around that time. And everybody that was pro-USSR seems to have shifted to, okay, well, China's the anti-US force, and we're primarily anti-US, not necessarily pro-USSR, even though they were largely took on the communist moniker. Mm-hmm. So I think that's what has happened, not necessarily elite capture.
Okay. Well, yeah, and for the audience, just don't forget, Petro is an out-and-out leftist. He was a member of the M19 communist guerrilla group back in the 80s or whatever, I don't know. And he was arrested, and and then after his arrest, he got out and he just said, "Okay, well, I'm not an armed revolutionary anymore, but he still is a revolutionary." You know what he reminds me of? He's kind of like, this is not a direct analogy, but he strikes me, well, I don't know. He's like a Colombian Obama almost. Like, he's obviously revolutionary, and he's doing a lot of things to upend the status quo in Colombia, including this pivot to China. Not that Obama did that, but just in terms of upending the Colombian government and trying to really shift it, push it much farther towards the left. So, Jared, thanks for that. And I think that is the last item for today?
Yes.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get into some questions then. All right. Do we have any kind of prediction on which party will win the 2028 election? No clue. No one does. I don't know. Like, what? It's a fair question to ask. It's impossible to know.
Yeah, it's way too early. I think it would be difficult to cite some kind of historical precedence, because Trump winning a second term after losing in 2020, or not, at least not taking office, there's only one other example, Grover Cleveland. Otherwise, that's not something that normally happens in U.S. politics. So 2028, I think there's a potential for something unprecedented to happen.
Mm. Oh, yeah, between 26 and 28, yeah, for sure. One thing that concerns me, the consensus that I'm getting from investment banks so far, like JP Morgan and Bank of America, they all come out and they say, yeah, the economy is probably more resilient than we feared earlier this spring. I think JP Morgan came out and said no recession until after the midterms, at least. And so the 2028 elections are, obviously the economy is one of the top, the economy and inflation are top concerns for voters. So, I think it probably depends on what happens with that recession, whether our debt situation forces Congress into essentially a chronic crisis. I think that may be one of the determining factors of the 28 election. Robert, if you just had to say like maybe one thing that could turn the 28 general election one way or the other, what would it be?
Immigration enforcement. I think if the Trump administration is successful at mass deportations, that I think that's going to be a big boost for the Trump base, and you'll see a lot of turnouts for whoever's running after Trump, especially if it's JD Vance.
Mm. Well, what do you mean when you say mass deportation? Because right now, Jared, what were the numbers? Claudia Sheinbaum gives us like a week. The Mexican president gives us like a weekly update. It's like what 70,000, something like that, 60,000 Mexican nationals, which in 6 months. Okay, so we won't be. We're not going to be clearing a million here anytime soon. So, go ahead, Jared.
Oh yeah, it was 75,000 total with 68,000 Mexican nationals, and that included repatriation. So not real sure, how much that was deportations or just people, which Mexico is running a repatriation program saying, hey, yeah, go to any consulate, we'll bring you back. She didn't publicize, hey, here's how many were deportations and repatriations. That 68,000 was both.
Yeah. Well, that is interesting. If the Mexican government is telling Mexican nationals here, don't get caught up in the CCOT stuff. Don't go wind up in Sudan. Just go to the Mexican consulate, any in the United States, and we'll make sure you get back. All right. So, Robert, what is the and I just ask out of curiosity, what is the mass and mass deportation? I know Stephen Miller wants this, but what's the case for not planefuls of 400, 500, how many ever illegals, but talking like 1,000 at a time?
Do you mean the cases in them actually being able to succeed at doing it?
Yeah, at mass deportation, not just doing whatever their arrest rate right now is. I've seen as low as 1,100. The acting ICE director said maybe on big days up to 2,500 a day, but that's obviously not sustained. So I don't know. Let's call it 1,500, 1,700 a day. That's a good start, but it's not mass deportation.
Yeah, I think we'll see those numbers increase after we see this funding implemented on the 1st of January, because a big chunk of that, roughly $160 billion, put toward all immigration enforcement, including like border wall construction. If I remember correctly, it was almost $40 billion. It was like 37 something billion dollars just for increasing ICE recruitment and training. Because I think they're trying to add an additional 10,000 ICE agents. I think after January 1st, when that goes into effect and we see how that's actually implemented and how fast ICE is able to surge numbers, because that's a huge amount of money. That's almost 4 times as much as the FBI's annual operations budget. Then we'll see, I think, how if the ICE can actually hit that. I think Stephen Miller's goal was like 3,000 or 3,500 arrests a day in order to get to something like 1 million, or I think 1 million per year. I think it's going to be determined on how that's actually implemented after January 1st.
Yeah. Man, even 1 million per year, just do the math on who's here versus how many millions are here versus 1 million per year. It's obviously going to be comparatively slow going. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Russia on, Jared, this is definitely a you question. Russia on Wednesday launched its most extensive naval exercise in recent years, spanning the Pacific, Arctic, Baltic, and Caspian seas. Is this just for show?
Not just for show, but not necessarily out of the norm. Militaries around the world love to use these grandiose adjectives. Russia does this from time to time. They'll get 10,000 plus sailors all linked up and go, okay, we're running an exercise. And then you see like maybe a dozen ships get underway, even though they're claiming hundreds involved. It's what it is it's probably just a computer run exercise connecting everybody. Militaries do this. That's why you don't see us reporting on it. It's pretty baseline. You need to have these, mass movement dry runs effectively.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right.
Nope, covered that one.
What level of elite capture does China have over the U.S.? would it play a significant role in war, i.e., pressuring Trump not to interfere with Taiwan or something to that effect? Well, in the first question, what level of elite capture does China have over the U.S.? I'm not faulting you. It's a vague question. I guess one question would be, does elite capture reach into the Trump administration? And if so, what level? I can't answer that question. Can either of you?
Not for the Trump administration, no.
Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to the federal government then, because, and I asked this, let me provide some context. So I always go back to this Army, in December 2020, there was an Army report that came out that talked about, it was the Army Facility Security Report. And they talked about foreign adversaries. They didn't mention China by name, but they're talking about China using transnational criminal organizations, using cyber attacks, using domestic protest groups, a number of other things. We're talking about conventional and unconventional tools or weapons here. And using the American people against the U.S. military would be unconventional. Using that against the United States in a period of crisis or conflict. So in terms of would elite capture play a significant role in war, like maybe fomenting, if we did get into an actual shooting war with China, there probably would be an anti-war movement, sizable one. I think that was Vietnam's big lesson. Didn't Ho Chi Minh say the war was fought in Vietnam, but the war was won in the United States or something like that? Yeah, basically you see, this huge communist push into the anti-war movement here. So, I think that's just baseline expectations. You have to expect that to happen. At what level that comes through elite capture, I don't know. But, obviously, if there are members of Congress, prominent political or social leaders pushing an anti-war message, the domestic situation could be extremely complex. I don't know. We'll ask Jared, what say you, and then Robert.
My primary concern wouldn't necessarily be in Congress, but at the sub-state level. I think we've seen that a couple times from the DOJ, where they come out and go, oh gosh, we found a whole network of them just running like election campaigns to get Chinese candidates into office at the local level. And those would be able to, coordinate or at least provide legal overhead to any kind of resistance effort to a war.
Jared,
on a local level.
Yeah, what that says to me is that we could see like the Sedition Act or something make a comeback if you have Chinese nationals and also U.S. citizens, dual citizens in the United States advocating for China, which would be an enemy in this conflict. Probably not to the level of Japanese internment camps, but obviously a lot more than any of us have ever seen in our lifetimes.
Yeah. Given just how we're looking at everything currently, all the environmental factors, we could see ICE move into the famous Chinatowns around New York, LA. I think San Francisco's got one. Like, why would those not be hubs for this?
Yeah, Robert.
As far as the private side, like CEOs that specifically mentioned, I think that comes before a crisis or conflict. Any kind of Chinese effort to exert influence through the tech sector would probably be a big one, just because of how prevalent Chinese nationals are throughout the U.S. tech sector. Any kind of tech-dependent imports, like critical minerals, things like that, I think China could, use that as influence over, EV manufacturers or what have you to try to put pressure on the Trump administration. But I think as far as elite capture, Canada is probably a bigger threat to the United States, in the sense that Chinese elite capture in Canada would probably disrupt, or could, I think, potentially disrupt any kind of Canadian cooperation with a conflict like that. And I say that because of that very famous case earlier this year, I think it was, where one Chinese national member of Canadian Parliament in the Liberal Party basically sent other Chinese national or ethnic Chinese Canadian nationals after his ethnic Chinese Conservative Party rival to try to get them to turn them into the Chinese consulate for a bounty. I think that's just one really good prominent example of the extensive Chinese influence in Canada. And if we were to rely on, the Anglosphere Five Eyes alliance in any kind of conflict. That's one potential avenue for Chinese disruption.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I do think it's important to note that if they were able to successfully pull Canada out of that is not currently, but will likely be the redundant energy source for the Asian allies, because we covered that. Yeah, the U.S. is ramping up shipments over there, but so is Canada. So they're pumping it all the way, around the Pacific over to Japan, who then distributes. You cut Canada off, and now you just have to deal with one source.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that would undercut the Japanese, maybe South Korean, maybe some other
Taiwan
Asian oil and gas importers. Yeah, plus Taiwan. All right, good question. Thanks for that. Consider the situation in the UK where Keir Starmer ran on being a middle-of-the-road Labour prime minister. Isn't there a huge credibility issue for Democrats? KH's Kamala Harris, I guess, border marching orders was do nothing. Well, I think this kind of goes back to Michael Every's point, which is we're probably not going back to the center. It is going to be Mamdani AOC style left-wing politics versus Trump, J.D. Vance, whoever style right-wing politics. And there's a strong case to be Michael Every makes a strong case. I don't see why that is not going to not happen. Robert?
Well, I think there are some other people that also got that also made that call, probably not as loudly as Michael Every, what's called now the tech right, like Mark Andreessen and Elon Musk. They saw exactly the same thing. That's what Mark Andreessen openly said. That's why all of these tech guys switched to the Trump camp last year, was that they saw the basically unofficial agreement between Democrats and the tech sector just collapsed over the last 10 years. And there was a lot more talk of much more left-wing policies, like I forget what the term for it is. It's basically a effective altruism, and they saw that there was a lot more talk from Democrats and progressives about taking their money because they said they weren't using it as effectively as it could be, seizing their wealth and also shutting down certain parts of the tech sector. And I think they saw the dynamic that's coming is they get a choice between more populist right under Trump, where they can still maintain their private businesses and their private wealth, even if they have to not offshore production or not hire foreign workers, or they get the other alternative future under a Harris administration and whoever follows of having their wealth seized for altruistic purposes, ostensibly, and some of their entire industries just shut down.
Mm-hmm. There's that book called Why Nations Fail. I liked it a lot. I've seen some people in my circles say they hated the book. I thought it was an excellent book. It's called Why Nations Fail. And the bottom line is that countries where you get extractive economic systems, basically where the government goes into the private sector of the economy and extracts too much money out. Eventually, private sector is going to run out of juice. And that's when you get an economic implosion and state breakdown. They talk about the Soviet Union, how in the beginning that worked well for the Soviet Union just in terms of GDP. The Soviet Union was running like 20% annual GDP in the 70s, I think in the 70s. But eventually you run out of other people's money, and that's exactly what they did. And that's one of the things that led to their implosion. So, if we see a populist left, Mamdani, AOC style president, whoever that's going to be, read the book, come to your own conclusion. But my conclusion from that was they're going to force the United States to run out of money, or force the elites into much more aggressively opposing those types of opposing that style of expropriation. All right, Robert, I'll give you the last word here.
Yeah, I think Mark Andreessen is a really good example to look for what how these guys conceptualized this choice. And the example he gave was that the Biden administration came to them and said that they were going to take control of AI, and only certain companies are going to be able to actually produce generative AI, and everyone else is going to be effectively banned. And I think that you're correct that there's not really the moderate Democrats don't seem to be winning, and I think that is the choice we're headed toward, is basically a right-wing populist or a left-wing populist future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, Michael Every says we're not going back to the center. I think he's right there. All right, Jared, any other good questions? All right, well, this will be the last one. You've talked many times about cyber attacks. With the latest reporting, single U.S. water utility received 6 million China-based connection attempts in 1 week. Is this escalation or more awareness? Well, my understanding, and listen, I'm not a cybersecurity guy, but just following this, and then Robert, you, of course, is there's a lot more network reconnaissance and exploitation to gain access right now than there is actual button pushing to turn things off. And the big risk is the more network reconnaissance you do, the more you enable private Chinese hacking groups or criminal hacking groups, or even just these corporate cyber teams to go in and find these zero-day exploits or find these vulnerabilities in U.S. critical infrastructure networks, and then turn around and sell those to the Chinese government or the Chinese military. You know, this one FBI official who was anonymously quoted in this Washington Post article from last week said, basically, you just greatly expand the surface area of potential targets. And that way, these Chinese PLA hacking units, they don't have to spend time developing, or they don't have to spend time searching for targets. They spend their time developing attacks for targets. And so that frees up a ton of time for them. If they don't have to do the finding, they really just focus on kind of the fixing and finishing. And so I think that's a massive risk here. I think in terms of escalation, we are obviously seeing month over month and year over year, a lot more network reconnaissance and probing and trying to just gain access in there and sit. And if nothing else, siphon off data. So I don't see why it couldn't be both escalation and more awareness. Robert, where do you see him?
I think escalation that's based on that report from that secretly in December, Chinese officials effectively told Biden officials, like, hey, warned them, hey, we have access to all your critical infrastructure. If you do something we don't like, we'll just shut it all down. And I think this is, especially this most recent hack, the zero-day exploit on the Microsoft SharePoint servers, has allowed them to gain effectively permanent access to a lot of these servers, because they stole the cryptographic keys that will, even after this exploit has been patched, they'll still be able to get access potentially for unlimited. Like there won't really be a way to stop them. And I think this is an escalation for a deterrent effect. I think China's thinking is that the more publicly, or the more they have access that the federal government knows about, the more escalatory power that has. Or I'm sorry, the more deterrence power that has.
Mm-hmm. You know, this kind of reminds me of, I don't know if anyone plays poker, but you know, sometimes you get a really good hand, and of course you can't just push all your chips in, you know, on the first, on the flop or whatever. So, you know, you kind of bait other poker players in. You know, you start with some low bids, and you try to get them to commit, and then you push them all in if you think you really have the cards. And Robert, I think that's very important. This is probably not like a 0 to 100 moment for China. If this is an actual deterrence strategy, then it does seem like we will see some minor level actions, which may not be attributed to China, but is obviously China. But, you know, basically that's a signal, as if you continue to go down this road, then you're going to see a lot more, and it'll be escalatory. And I bring this up because my big takeaway from that book, Unrestricted Warfare, which was written by those two Chinese PLA colonels that was published back in the 90s, basically it's a manual on how to, not exactly how to fight war with the United States, but how to defeat the United States. My big conclusion from that was one thing. They want to, the Chinese want to force the United States into a strategic dilemma where U.S. leaders choose national survival over their geopolitical policies, which would be Taiwan. So how do you push the United States into that strategic dilemma? I mean, obviously, it's the internet, it's energy, it's communications, highly vulnerable critical infrastructure. It's not like you shut down oil and gas, you shut down power. This is not just like a start-stop thing. It's going to take time to recover. And I think that the big 2020 COVID and then the 2022 commodities crisis when Russia went into Ukraine, you break those supply chains and they're not easily fixed. It takes a long time. So that's very concerning to me. Robert, how do you see it?
Yeah, I think it is. I think Jared's talked about it before. The PLA, their idea is that if they have to, they'd fight a decisive battle in the Pacific. But I think the real decider of how the struggle over hegemony shakes out between China and the U.S. is the preamble to any kind of actual military crisis or conflict. And it's going to be determined by who is able to contain each other in their respective hemispheres. Because as much as Elbridge Colby has talked about the China containment, trying to contain them in the Indo-Pacific, China has been doing the same to us and has had a major head start with the Belt and Road Initiative, especially in Latin America.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. All right, Jared says we got one more good question teed up, and then that's it. How to find instigator groups in my area? Are there keywords I can use to search? Well, that's a fantastic question. That's something I've talked a lot about. I've done several online courses about how to do this stuff. So yeah, number one, you can start with the Google search or whatever search engine you want. And there's a couple of different tactics you can use, but you can just literally just Google political activism, Travis County, political activism, Austin, Texas, wherever you live. You can use the two parts of that search term, which is, what you're looking for in the area that you're looking for. Also, you used to be able to go on a social media and find a lot of these groups, but even the far left groups were banned, or many of the far left groups were banned from social media in 2020 when they did that big crackdown, along with right-wing groups, obviously, of course, as well. So, a lot of these, the more active the group, the more likely it is that they're going to have some sort of social media presence. I would also say some of these groups run websites or blogs. If you just let's just think about this logically here. If you're a group, you're trying to spread your message, right? You want as many people to know about your upcoming protest or direct action as possible. And so how do you get that message out? Part of it's going to be online. So is there an email list? If so, just start up a fresh burner email and go sign up for all these lists that you can. Social media, obviously, if you publish something on social media, maybe it gets shared. I would also not overlook physical spaces. Online is good, but find the subversive spaces, the coffee shops, the bookstores where these types of people congregate, and go look on the bulletin board. Or sometimes there's flyers, people, there's a stack of 20 whatever pieces of paper, little flyer things. Go in those stores and collect that stuff. Also, if you live in a college or university area, you probably have a college paper or some other type of underground newspaper. And I say underground, and I mean like kind of small circulation, very niche. But they're going to be leftist newspapers. So go and find those things as well. Searching online is fantastic. Great place to start. Huge ROI, obviously. And a lot of that stuff's free, very low effort. You just got to type with your fingers. But don't overlook also driving around and scoping out those places where these people are they're recruiting, they're holding meetings there, they're trying to get their message out there. Don't overlook the physical space. Great question. And that's going to do it. Everyone, thanks so much for the support. That's going to do it for today's morning brief. It's also going to do it for this week. So listen, hope you have a great weekend, and we'll be back in your inbox on Monday, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.